Hello, I'm Steve, and welcome to I'd Rather Be Making. And today I'm making resin coasters with LEDs in them. I thought adding LEDs to an organic themed coaster would be a neat way to blend technology and nature. And the epoxy will act as a waveguide and direct some of the light into the glass and through the beverage, as you can see here. I make a mistake in this project, and I also learned from it. See the bubbles in that wood there? I found what causes it, and most importantly, I found how to prevent it. Now let's get to making. For the organic part, I started with a piece of wood from my woodpile. I cut it into thin discs. Well, here's what I got. As you can see, a lot of the bark fell off of some of the pieces. I'm not sure this step is necessary, but I wanted to make sure the wood was dry, so I put it in the toaster oven for 30 minutes. I thought it would be neat if I could find a stone that would let the LED light pass through it. I noticed in my driveway there's multicolored stones, and whitish ones like this are translucent. They'll let light pass through them. So I got a collection of them, a couple of batteries and an LED. Then I could see which rocks would glow when LED light is passing through it. That's a nice one. You need something to hold your epoxy. You could use an empty container, but you'd be left with some features you may not want. If you have PVC, great. I don't, so buying it's almost $13. I could 3D print something much cheaper. That's more like it. So on to Fusion 360. I just need to make a simple cylinder, the dimensions I want my coaster to be, and export it. When you print your cylinder, you don't need a top, you just need the bottom and the sides. Looks like it'll take 45 minutes to print, but the material cost is only 12 cents. And now to my rapid printer. I wish it were that fast. That simple cylinder there gives me a coaster that looks like this, where I'm able to leave the background. And it has a nice square edge that makes it easy to separate the side from. I also wanted to make a coaster that you could see through, like the one here on the left. To make it easier to separate from the mold, I added a radius to the edge here. And that'll give me coasters that look like these two here. But I want something more. I wanted to make coasters with LEDs in them. That'll make my glass glow in the dark. So back to Fusion 360. I'll quickly go through what I did. I used the mold I made with the curved bottom. I made a hole for a battery holder and a box. I wanted the LED light to go through the epoxy like a waveguide, and I wanted to see this on the edges of the epoxy. So I wanted to pull off part of the mold and leave part of it behind. To do that, I made part of the mold thinner, so it would be easier to cut away. That's that perimeter here that I'm lowering. And this is what it looks like printed. I started placing the things I wanted to encapsulate to get an idea of what they would look like. I have a theme in mind for my LED glowing rock. I'll position it here in the center, and the energy from it will radiate and hit the wood here, causing it to char a bit. I'll just hit the sides lightly. The torch is also useful for getting rid of the bubbles that form on the top of the epoxy, the pesky ones that are introduced from mixing. Okay, here they are, and this is about where I want them. So I'll put a little dot where I want the LED to poke through. You can't get the wood to balance on an LED, so I made this little ring to hold the wood up. To poke the LEDs through the 3D printed material, I just heated up one leg at a time, and they poked right through. I bent the LEDs over so they'd be as low as possible. Here I'm marking the polarity of the LEDs. Now I'm making my circuit. Bend the legs in the right position, and to keep from melting the plastic, I used a small piece of foil to spread the heat out. It worked quite well. I'll spare you watching me make every single connection. To keep the epoxy from leaking out where the LEDs are passing through, I melted some wax along the bottom here. The wax is also a handy mold release agent. You could use anything, but don't use oil. Oil will mix with the epoxy and it won't cure right. You can use paraffin wax, candle wax, or even crayons. You'll want to use a casting epoxy. They cure slower, make less heat, and are formulated for thicker pours. Mix your epoxy according to the directions. Most casting epoxies are a 1-to-1 mixture. I thought I'd pour the epoxy in 2 stages. The first one would be a thinner pour. That would make it easier to align the parts. Then after that's cured, all I'll need to do is top the mold off with the rest of the epoxy. I tried not to get air in the epoxy when I mixed it, but as you can see, it was unavoidable. That's where the torch comes in handy. The torch quickly heats the bubbles and they expand and pop. All you need to do is briefly touch the bubbles for this to work. Be careful not to dwell too long over the epoxy or you'll start to burn it. Now I'm ready for the final pour. It goes much easier than the first one, but I made a mistake that we'll see later. The torch will help some, but it won't fix the mistake I made. After they've cured, it's time to separate the coaster from the mold. This is the one with the curved bottom. The wax makes it very easy to separate the mold from the epoxy. This is the one that's going to have the plastic as a background. The square edge makes it easy to separate the side from the bottom. That looks nice. It might need a little sanding though. Now here I'm going to cut down with a knife along this edge. Oh, I was so lucky I didn't cut my thumb doing that. It unzips real easy. That worked out great. Needs sanding too though. And now I notice a lot of bubbles, mainly on that one on the right. But here there's not many bubbles. Little spot there without bubbles too. There's no bubbles here on the left, so there's got to be a reason why these areas have bubbles, and the one on the right is full of bubbles. Let's look at the part of the video where I was pouring this. This here, and that spot there were no bubbles. Same thing here. Everywhere it was wet, there are no bubbles. All these dry areas had a lot of bubbles. And the deeper the epoxy was, the more bubbles there were. If I understand this correctly now, I should be able to make one bubble-free. But I'm almost out of epoxy. So back to Fusion 360 to make a mold that will use less epoxy. To use less epoxy, this is going to get a lot more crowded. And I'll use 4 LEDs too. Time for some rapid solder. Drip some wax to seal the holes. And position the parts. Okay, this time pouring the epoxy, I'm going to cover the wood, but with a thin layer so it can run off. I see some bubbles forming, but the torch will take care of that. Here goes the last of the epoxy. I'm going to use every last drop. It's not quite enough. There's bubbles on top, but the torch will take care of those. But I don't see any coming from the wood, so I think I've got this nailed now. While that's curing, I'll work on the battery holder. I made a feature in the holder that'll retain the switch. It latches in and won't pull out. Also, polarity for the battery is molded right into the housing, so you know which way to plug your batteries in. Alright, let's test it. No voltage in this position. Switch it. And we have voltage. Good, solder it in. Probably should have used the foil trick here, but I was careful. And it works. For the backing, I just glued some felt on and cut it off. I didn't make a cover for the battery pack, since the coaster itself acts as a cover when it's setting down. These faceted sides aren't going to work for me. I don't want to scatter the light that way, I want it to be more diffused, so we'll sand them off. I used a random orbit sander and rolled around the edges. That worked pretty well for the round part. The curved part here, I just had to do by hand. It was the only way to really roll it around the edge. And the bottom, I used the random orbit sander again. This part I needed to do by hand as well. Needed something square that I could get up along the edge, so I folded a piece of sandpaper. It came out pretty nice. That just scattered the light very well. Yay, the new epoxy's here. Now I can finish the project. I'll be extra careful to not mix any bubbles in. But there still will be some. I'll just take care of them later. I hit the surface with the torch just to blow off any dust and slightly change the surface energy so the epoxy will stick to itself better. Pour just enough to finish it off. And it came out very nice. There's no bubbles from the wood. The LEDs don't look too bright with the room light on, but it's not meant for that condition. It was meant for this, low light conditions, like in your home theater. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see me make more mistakes and hopefully recover, please subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified. Oh, and please leave a comment if you want to see that battery holder project. That's it for now. Time to sit back and watch a movie.